Mine? I'm on. First, let me, not quite under two. So, congratulations, people who have come here to discussion. And in addition, 20 for 4. So wherever you are, thank you. Is in Florida and who is the film about your story is her favorite film about the Holocaust ever. So I'm very impressed with that. My sister's a tough judge. I'm Jack Klieger. I'm president and CEO of the museum, and I want to welcome you all, the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Thanks for joining us, both in person and on live stream. I want to thank our staff, particularly Sidney Yeager, for all the work you've done, and also Izzy Molina, and of course, Josh Mack and his team. Yes? Can I hold my mic? Is that all right? Had a chance early. Courage to act. Also, thank you to our tenor. And who else? We have other board members here. Wait a minute. How are you, Amy? Amy Tenor. Any other board members here? No. Okay. If you've seen Courage to come back as many times as possible. It's an educational and informative story about collective action and mutual aid. And it's in this room here. So having that here, event here is sort of very poetic about mutual aid. And you'll hear more about that. I'd like you to take a minute to silence your phones and time for audience questions at the end of the questions as well from the chat. We're honored tonight to have, as part of our Story Survive series, Peter will be talking about the brave actions of Peter's grandparents, Gilbert and Eleanor. They'll be in conversation with Stephanie Butnick, longtime co-host of Tablet Magazine, Unorthodox, and co-author of the newish Jewish and Abraham to Zabars with everything in between. In addition, she recently launched Golda, a newsletter, Jewish lifestyle newsletter, offering everything you need to know about a new word for me, a Jewishly life. Jewishly, that's like Yiddishkeit in English. Now, introduce Peter, Jill, and Stephanie.
Thank you, Jack, and to the whole museum staff for having us. And thanks to both of you. I want to welcome everyone to tonight's Story Survive conversation featuring the Kraus family and their story. I'm honored to be here tonight with Peter and Jill Kraus to hear about their family's inspiring story and legacy. Welcome, Peter and Jill.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
So let's go back to before you discover a manuscript that in many ways changes so much about what you know about your family and then the course of sort of your lives since. Let's go back to before that. Who are Peter and Jill Kraus?
We're like, I just wear a suit and tie. Honestly, I think that's the answer. I don't think we're anything unique. I think we go about our lives just like everybody else does. We try to be involved. We've been involved in charity pretty much since we were in our early 20s. And
I think they want to know what you do, too.
Oh, you want to know what I do?
Where do you live? What is your
That's
family?
not, I mean, I've been in finance, so, there you go.
And where are you based? Where do
In
you
New
guys
York.
live?
In New York.
Yeah, we're in New York, but Peter and I both grew up in Philadelphia, in the towns next to each other. So, yep.
Yeah,
And
actually,
apparently we were in the same Sunday school class together as children, but we don't remember each other.
well, that's
And
because I
met-
never really finished Sunday school.
and met in New York on our own, so.
I love that.
That is true. There's a little bit deeper story to that. So after my first date with Jill, she said, "Are you from Philadelphia?" Of course, I told her. And then she, of course, called her mother and said, "Do you know the Krauses from Philadelphia?" And her mother said, "Well, if your date's father's name is Steve, then in fact, I do know him. And in fact, your grandmother dated his grandfather." So the grandfather, you know, the main Gilbert, who's the main character here, could have in fact married her grandmother.
Which would have led to like a different evening.
You
here
know,
That would have
tonight.
been a different evening, yes, exactly.
The Jewish community is small in Philadelphia. And it's sort of, on one side of the river are the German Jews, and on the other side of the river are the Russian Jews. And so so if you were a German Jew, your families knew each other.
And dated.
And dated, apparently, yes.
So tell us about discovering this manuscript. Set the scene for us and a little bit about the story of your grandparents' wartime heroism that you discover.
Well, my father's father and my father's mother lived in Philadelphia, and they lived when I was alive and conscious about it. They lived in Center City in Rittenhouse Square. I knew that my grandfather and grandmother and father grew up originally in a place in Philadelphia called Germantown, and then moved to Center City sometime around when he was a young boy. I'm in Long Beach Island as well, actually when he was 1 or 2 years old, but that didn't last very long. They came back to Philadelphia. So, you know, my grandfather was a reasonably talented man. He was a photographer. He was a pianist. He was a painter. He was kind of a man for every season. Really Renaissance man. He actually went to University of Pennsylvania. He was on the football in 1900 whatever. You know, I have a picture of him with a leather helmet on. So he was he was an interesting guy, but he was also kind of I wouldn't call it warm and fuzzy. He wasn't the grandfather you sat in his lap and said, "Hi, Grandpa, tell me stories." But he did give me his camera equipment, and I actually, started taking pictures and using that, and that was a great joy for me. My grandmother was a little wacky. I actually thought she was nuts. I didn't think that whatever she said made any sense or was accurate, and she was relatively emotional. So they were an interesting pair, to be fair about it. And also, they retired. My grandfather retired very early in life. In his late 40s, he stopped working. He retired. He went to a place called Doylestown, Pennsylvania, which is outside of Philadelphia, and he became the Attorney General for Doylestown. He was a lawyer.
But he also started legal aid.
He did start
in
legal
that
aid
county.
in the county, and while he was working in Philadelphia, he was the editor or the publisher
Yeah,
of
he was the
small
publisher
newspaper,
of the
Philadelphia Ledger.
Philadelphia Ledger, and he was a labor lawyer at the height of the labor movement in the United States. So he was a very well-respected labor lawyer.
Yeah. So he passed away when I was in my early 20s, and my grandmother, died 10 or 15 years later. So sometime around my 50th birthday, 52nd birthday, somewhere in there, was my father's 80th birthday.
No, it was before your father's 80th birthday.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I get the story straight.
Yeah, I gotta keep him on.
This is like some
straight
serious
and narrow.
fact checking. I love it.
Right.
Yeah, I get fact
It
checked.
was 2004.
2004.
Yeah.
That would be 2004, dear. And I got a package from my father, and it was in a brown manila envelope, 8.5 by 11-inch envelope, and had a little note on it that said, family history thought you ought to know. So I took out what was in the envelope, obviously, and it was a manuscript, but it was typed double spaced. But it wasn't the actual original. It was, you know, a carbon copy. And that's when they had carbon paper. Not that anyone in this generation would know what carbon paper was. And in any case, I looked at the end of it, and it said EJP, which was my grandmother's initials. And so I was sort of intrigued, because I didn't think my grandmother, you heard what I thought about my grandmother. So I sat down and started to read it. And it, you know, wasn't that long. It took me, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, and I finished reading it, and I called my father up and I said, "Is this true?" And he said, "Yeah." And I yelled at him. I said, "Like, are you out of your mind? Like, you didn't think this was a good idea to sort of share with your children while we were growing up? Like, this was like a story." And, you know, he didn't really have a lot to add at that point. And I showed it to Jill, and I basically said to Jill, "I don't think it's true, because my grandmother's a nut, but, you know, you can read it." So she read it, and then she should take over the story.
So I decided I would do the research on this, and Peter's father's birthday was, his 80th birthday was 2 years later. And his mother said, you know, we should all take a family trip. We'll go to Aspen and hike. And I'm like, ugh. And
Jill, does
said, why don't we redo the trip? I mean, their trip, because in this manuscript we had all the hotels, where they'd been, all the places they worked with. But, you know, this is like many years after the Holocaust. Like, did any of these places exist? So.
And in fact, was the story accurate? We didn't know if the story was accurate.
And so I just started making telephone calls, and I called a rabbi who seemed completely uninterested. I don't know why, but he was, and gave me no and gave me no leads. And you guys here were actually said to us, you should call the Holocaust Museum, and gave us the name of someone at the Holocaust Museum to call. It was a gentleman named Paul Shapiro, who was in charge of Holocaust research at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And I called him on the phone and sort of gave him an abbreviated version of the story, and he was just, there was silence.
Will you give us like that abbreviated version?
Yeah, so this story is, in 1939, as I said, Peter's grandfather was a lawyer in Philadelphia, and there was an organization in Philadelphia which Peter's great-grandfather had been one of the founders of, called Bris Shalom. And when people ask me what Bris Shalom was, I said the closest thing I can think of is that it was the Jewish version of Knights of Columbus. You know, it was like a fraternal organization. And he was in his office one day, and Louis Levine, wasn't that? Yeah, Louis Levine, who ran Bris Shalom, came to his office and said, we have an idea. We have a camp, and it has 50 beds. And if you can figure out how to get 50 kids here, we can house them. So
the idea was actually to continue to do it.
Yeah.
It was 50 kids, get them rehabilitated in the United States, connected with families, and then another 50 kids. That was the concept.
So that was the original idea. And so Peter's grandfather was pretty well connected in Washington, knew people at the State Department. And they went down to talk to the State Department, and there were no visas to be had at that time.
This was 1938, 37, 38.
No, it was 39.
No,
This-
39 when he went, but I think he started the process.
So the end of 38. And so he went to Washington, and they met with people at the State Department who said to them, he had an idea that he thought might work. And the idea was that there were dead visas. Dead visas meaning visas that people had applied for and never used. So, maybe they went to China instead of waiting for the US, or to Japan during the Holocaust. And there were populations that did that, or they died, or they decided not to go, or whatever, but there were unused visas. So,
And at the time, you'll recall the history, there were quotas on visas. And the quota in Germany were 800. So you couldn't bring more than 800 people into this country from Germany at that time. And you couldn't increase the quota, and the history of changing the laws or trying to change the laws, and Roosevelt pocket vetoing the law, and nothing ever happened, and the stories of people who tried to come here and couldn't come here. So the issue was, how could he figure out how to bring people into the country legally with that particular quota?
So they went to Washington, and his idea was to use these dead visas, these unused visas. And so the State Department said to him, well, actually, sounds like an interesting idea, but we don't know if it'll work, because visas are given out at the point of embarkation. Washington did not give out the visas. So it was the embassy in Germany, or in Austria, as it ended up being, that had to do this. So they had to have a sponsor for every child. So the 50 children, so it was Peter's grandmother, Eleanor's job to go and find a sponsor for every child. And that was pretty complicated. I mean, these are the days before computers, and everything's handwritten, and things like that. And they had to get the mortgage papers for every person, the tax returns for every person. I mean, do you remember? I mean, it was like...
Yeah, they needed tax returns, and mortgage paper, and insurance papers.
Oh yeah, insurance, life insurance papers.
So that they could, those were the requirements that immigration, U.S. immigration, actually required the sponsor to provide, because the sponsor had to have a source of income, they had to have a house where the immigrant could stay, and they had to have an insurance policy on their life in case they died. There was some proceeds that could continue the process.
So she went to all of their friends and asked each one of the friends to then do this.
And only one person could be sponsored by one family.
Yeah. So it was months of paperwork, and then they went to Washington after all the papers were done. They went back to Washington, and the person at the State Department said to them, listen, it's too dangerous now for women to go to Germany. So we think Eleanor shouldn't go. She should stay back. This was time when women were considered the weaker sex. And so they decided that they would ask their pediatrician to go with them, because they felt maybe they needed a doctor to go with them. So they asked their pediatrician, who was a widower, had 2 children, if he would leave his kids in Philadelphia and go with them too. And he said yes. In the interim, the very wealthy people from Philadelphia and New York tried to stop them from doing it. They did not want press. They wanted, to become invisible. And so they would come every day, like one by one, to Peter's grandfather's office and say, you need to stop this. This is nonsense. And you need to, or we will ruin your business. And so at that point, they realized they really had to go underground to do this, and they couldn't really be public at all. And I think that is ultimately why it was never talked about in the family, that this became a secret mission. And so Peter's grandfather and his grandmother, she stayed in Philadelphia with their children, and he went to Germany with the pediatrician. When they got to Germany, they felt it was safer, and that Peter's grandmother could come. And so she took a boat by herself later on. There's a very funny part of the manuscript where she thinks she's going to get raped by the purser, and she was a bit crazy.
I'm telling you, she was nuts.
And so they met in Germany, and they
They met in Paris, and then
Yeah.
they traveled to Germany.
to Germany, and the Germans basically said to them, or the German Jewish community said to them, it's way worse in Austria. This is May of '39. It's way worse in Austria. You should go to Austria and get the children from Austria. So then they traveled to Vienna, and they interviewed 600 children between the age of 4 and 16. The criteria was that they were healthy, that they could separate from their parents, and that they could be somewhat independent, which is shocking to me to think that a 4-year-old could do that. And so they went from Vienna to Berlin, and they stayed at we went to, what was the name of the synagogue in Berlin, but which neighborhood is that? I can't remember.
Prince Lauerberg.
Prince Lauerberg. And they stayed there, and they got all the papers done. And they went and they got steerage on a boat for 50 people, and brought them to the United States. And there's this wonderful, very famous picture, actually, of these children on a bow of a boat staring at the Statue of Liberty. And that was this group of kids. So,
Wow. And it's also not lost on us. I mean, you can see the Statue of
You can
Liberty
see the
right
Statue
over
of Liberty,
there.
yeah.
This is
exactly.
So we
incredibly
didn't know if
powerful.
this was actually true. This was the manuscript. So Jill called Shapiro, Paul Shapiro at the Holocaust Museum, and they researched it and called her back and said, well, not only is this the first time we've ever heard about this, but this is true. And there were certain references in the documentation or in the manuscript about people, places, and times that allowed the Holocaust Museum to do research it had never done.
Yeah,
Because the
because-
information was public, but there's hundreds and hundreds of
No,
thousands.
but the information had just become
No,
public.
in Vienna, but even in the United
No,
States.
no, in the United States, it had just become public, and the...
More fact-checking here.
What?
More fact-checking.
It's a family story. We all
Right,
tell it together. It's
exactly.
perfect.
Exactly. And so they had just, a lot of the documents on the Holocaust had been put under, no can see. And so they had just been opened up for research. And so because Peter's grandmother had so many names in this manuscript, when I sent it to them, they were like, oh my God, now we know where to start. And at the same time, we were saying we want to go to, for Peter's father's 80th birthday, we wanted to go to Germany and Austria to redo the trip. They also told us that they had just found an apartment in Vienna that had 90 boxes of documents that were just found. And in those 90 boxes were 600 applications for children for Peter's grandparents to bring. We found all of those, and that was sort of, so we spent a whole day at the synagogue in Vienna, which is where the community center was, which is where they interviewed all the children.
So I want to talk a little bit more about that trip for your family and sort of reclaiming that legacy that had sort of been, silenced for so long. But first I want to know what happens to the kids when they get off the boat? They go to the camp?
They went to the camp
In Philadelphia.
and they were either sent to live with relatives. All the parents had to have, the other criteria was the parents had to have already applied for visas. So in hopes that the parents would come. And, many did, but not all. And so that was,
Yeah, they two of the children actually stayed with my grandparents.
Yeah.
And when we found out about this, my cousin, who is my father's sister's only daughter, had some of the documentation. She had some of the passports from the children, and so she had some information, and we used that information plus the film itself to actually try to identify more of the children. And in the film, if you watch the film, there are a number of people that are interviewed, I think almost all of which have passed on, who told their part of the story. And one particularly riveting story was a woman who I think might have been 90 at the time, who last saw her mother when she left Vienna, and her mother never made it to the United States. And there's a passage in the manuscript that's actually quite touching. In Germany and in Austria, Jews could not raise their hand to wave goodbye because that was
it was illegal
illegal to Heil Hitler
to
for a Jew
do
to do
this.
that.
So
That
if
was
they raised their
disrespectful.
hand to wave, that could be that the police had been told to arrest the parents.
So the
Say,
parents waited on the station or
with
at
their-
the station
with
with their arms at their
side.
side as their children left where they went in cattle cars. They did not go in passenger trains from Vienna to Berlin. So it's, there's a lot of tough emotions that happened in the process. And there were one or two children that got sick and didn't make the trip and were replaced.
One child who
and
was replaced
he
last day
he ended up at a concentration camp and was killed.
and died.
It sort of sounds like your grandparents were amazing, but very regular people, right? They weren't, this sort of seems like something they took on, not out of nowhere. I mean, clearly there's a family legacy of service and philanthropy with that organization that your great-grandfather founded, but I guess I'm just wondering, like, what motivated these two people who had a family in Philadelphia, who are American Jews? I mean, how do you sort of understand that call for them
It's
to go
not,
back?
it's just not easy to understand it, actually. It just isn't. I don't know how you can put yourself at that time. You have to remember, so they're going across the ocean in 1939. The doctor and my grandfather get there, as Jill said earlier, and then my grandmother comes later. They meet in Paris. They travel by train. I think my grandmother gets there in April or May. They're away for 2.5 months. Their children are now being watched by a caretaker. They know they're going to Germany or Europe, and they know there's going to be a war. I mean, there was no mistaking the fact that there was going to be war. They were in Vienna and listening to the troops as they went to the front. there were, my grandfather would sort of leave for hours at a time. My grandma didn't know where he went.
He was working with the underground.
There was, fear, consternation, impracticality, and then the question of, well, could you actually get the children out? Because you didn't know, and the U.S. government didn't know, and my grandfather didn't know whether or not, when he showed up at the German embassy, whether the Germans would let him
Berlin,
out.
so he had to take the children from Austria to Berlin to get the visas.
And, you have to also remember, this is after Kristallnacht in Austria. Jews were,
Berlin.
in Austria and in Berlin, and Jews were being persecuted, and they were being, you were walking around with yellow stars on, and this was not.
They were
like,
in it, yeah.
This was like, this was not good, and they were there, and would you leave your children? Would you leave your 2 children behind and go to a war zone, and on the basis of trying to find 50 children and bring them back and go through all of this and put yourself in physical danger? I don't know. It's why we actually tell this story. It's why we're, supportive of it, because it's hard for us to replicate what they did, yet they did it.
So tell us more about this trip that your family takes. Your parents go back, because, this had sort of been submerged for whatever reason, right? They weren't looking for plaudits or credit or anything like that, so much so that you didn't even know this story.
People say, in a world of social media, it's kind of completely incomprehensible that, you wouldn't publicize what you were doing. But of course they didn't. I think, as Jill points out, the reason for that is the anti-Semitism in this country. And it's also hard for us to understand, although unfortunately, I think the anti-Semitic winds are growing all over the world. But in this country, there were public displays of anti-Semitism in this city.
Nazism.
And Nazism in this city and in Philadelphia, and Jews did not feel safe in this country. And so it's understandable why they didn't publicize it. Why our family never talked about it, that one I can't answer. As I said to my father, are you kidding? Why didn't you
What was that casual note? I think you should know about this.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
That did seem a little weird to me.
It's a true understatement.
Peter's father was not a warm, fuzzy guy, so.
Neither was his father, so
Right.
it followed suit. But I can't explain that one. But I do understand why it was not, in the public domain. So when we went back to Europe, it was sort of a discovery for the family, and I think we wanted to do it because we wanted to sort of honor our grandparents and my father, and so that he would have a chance to actually, because he was 12 at the time, and his sister was 8, I think. And yet he didn't really know that much about it either. And at the end of the day, he experienced, a year of it, but then he went on, and life went on, and, he didn't really have much connectivity to any of the kids. So it was also an opportunity for him, and it was emotional for him. When we went to the Vienna Jewish Center, and we were looking through the 600 applications, all written in German, which, by the way, I had no idea that my grandfather spoke German, or maybe he didn't, but he somehow understood what, what was going on.
No, he did speak German.
So that was another, aha moment, oh, really? I had no clue. And it was very emotional for my father. He was, he was in tears, participating. And it was still emotional for me. And I really can't explain why, but it is.
So since this all came to light, and I know, of course, there is a film about this on HBO, what happened with the children and their descendants? Is there sort of community between them? Were they?
Well, it was really when we didn't really try to track down the descendants. We tracked down the story, and that was it. When the film was made, a lot of the descendants were found, or a number of the descendants were found. What happened when the film came out, though, was they all came out. they like came out of the woodwork. And they were, calling HBO and saying, I'm one of the children, I live in Israel, I live, in Boston, I live in, all of they had
And it wasn't the
dispersed-
children that were calling, it was the children's children.
Right.
It was
No,
the-
it was, some of them were
Some,
the children.
some were,
Yeah,
but
they're-
mostly it was the
yeah.
children's children.
And then when we started doing these presentations, when the film came out, we did the original opening at the Jewish Museum in Philadelphia, and people in the audience came up to Peter and said, my name is da-da-da, if not for your grandfather, I wouldn't be here today. And they were like our age, and it was their grandparents, their parents who, and, they would say things like, do you have any idea what 50 children multiplied over multiple generations is like?
So I want to go back. Trust me, we will go to your questions because I'm sure everyone has a lot they want to ask. But what do you think prompted Eleanor to write this story down, and when do you think she did it, and why?
Well, I media existed, my grandmother would be on it. So
She would be like viral.
Yeah, I think that was, that was her personality, and I think she wanted to write it down so that people would know it actually happened and that they would know that she did it.
I mean, some of the things in the manuscript are things like they're at the Adlon Hotel when they arrive in Germany with the children, and Gilbert says to his wife, you go to the hotel and with the pediatrician, and I'm going to the U.S. Embassy to make sure that we can do all of this. And she gets to the Adlon Hotel, and there's huge parades outside, and they can't get up to the front door of the hotel. The taxi cab driver said, we're going to have to leave you here, and you're going to have to take all the suitcases and get in the hotel themselves. Well, it was the day the armistice was signed between Germany and Italy, and it was signed in the hotel they were staying in, and she went up the elevator, the birdcage elevator at the Adlon Hotel with von Ribbentrop and
The Italian, wasn't the prime minister, but
yeah, and
the
she,
foreign minister.
and she and
Now, we don't have a clue whether that happened. I told
I
you my
believe it.
grandmother's a little
I
nutty.
believe it. That sounds.
Yeah, but, she did, she also, she wore a hat. She was a big lady for hats, and she
talks about her hat a
talked
lot.
about her hat
in
a
the
lot.
manuscript.
And her hat, she used her hat as kind of the imprimatur to get through the crowd.
And she had a red bird on her hat.
And the other story that she tells is getting to Europe, and it still says she thought she was going to be molested by the purser.
The purser, yes.
But the purser did tell her to disembark in Paris as opposed
No.
to Hamburg.
No, Le Havre.
Le Havre, yeah, Le
Le
Havre.
Havre.
Yeah, as opposed to, I guess, Germany. And she was supposed to get off in Hamburg, and she got off in Le Havre. And she took the SS Paris, was the ship that she took over. And she describes that the SS Paris was burned to the keel after she disembarked and would have never made it to Hamburg. And that was another one of, that's ridiculous, that didn't happen. So, but I actually did the work on that, and it did happen. So, and then there's another part of the story where they're traveling from Paris to Berlin, and they get to some town in Germany, and they disembark for changing locomotives or whatever, and Hitler is on the loudspeaker making a speech.
It was his birthday.
It was his birthday. So I said, another ridiculous story, but I looked that up, and in fact, it was his birthday, and in fact, he was known to give speeches during his birthday. So, yeah, I mean, there was probably more truth to it than I thought.
So, knowing all of this, having done all the research and all the work and traveled back, I'm curious, how has this story, changed the two of you? And personally, and how you see the world, and how has it changed your lives? I mean, you're here tonight, you do this kind of conversation a lot. How has this sort of changed the trajectory of your own lives?
Well, I think that we've gotten involved in immigration issues. When Trump closed the border in his first term, we put together a grant program for synagogues to take in immigrants around the country that we did with the URJ, Union of Reform Judaism. I've done some work with the UNHCR as well, so in helping them raise money. And so I think a little bit of that. We have a endowed chair at the Holocaust Museum in Washington to study children during the Holocaust. So I think those are, most of our interests are in the visual arts, but that's become a sort of a secondary, and I don't think that would have happened at all if it weren't for this.
I think I do feel a little, I don't know how else to explain this, but guilty for not being able to do what they did. Like what role am I playing here? It's part of my emotional reaction to it. Is I don't really feel like I'm living up to what he did, and we're trying to do what we can do. I think it's part of the reason why I like giving these talks, because it's a way of communicating to people that it really does matter what you do, and it is an individual thing. My grandparents were just normal people. There wasn't anything special about them. I mean, obviously, you're saying to yourself, well, it sounds like they were pretty special, but I'm telling you, they were just like everybody else. He put his pants on one leg at a time, and that's who they were. I do think people make a difference in the world, and I think you can only do that one person at a time, and it's like you have to do it, by touch and feel and in front of people. It's not something you can do in wide stadiums, speeches, and what have you. I think you have to do it, as I say, one person at a time.
It was before we found out about all of this, we were at a UJA dinner in New York, and there was a gentleman that I used to do business with who was from Providence, Rhode Island, and he was a German refugee. And he was a relatively successful person in Rhode Island, and he had invited us to sit at his table at the UJA benefit. And Peter walked in, and Peter had never met him before, and he said to Peter, "Is your grandfather from Philadelphia?" Now, this is way before we knew anything about this. This is like 1980s. And Peter said, yes. And he said, "Did your grandfather drive a Rolls Royce?" And Peter said, "No, but what'd you say, he had a Duesenberg?
He had a car that looked like a Rolls Royce.
Right.
So if you were 10 coming from Germany, you would think it was a Rolls
Yeah,
Royce.
so he said, "Well, I only met your grandfather once when he picked me up from the boat." So we actually think that there are other, and we didn't know anything about the manuscript at that point. And Peter was like, "Yeah, right." And so we actually think that there were other one-offs, and that they had planned to go back and do another group, but that war broke out. So.
I think, one other thing for me that it is just very personal, but because of that story and because of what they were involved in, I started reading history in this time period, but it spread like a little bit wildfire for me. and I've read, I don't know, 50 books now over the course of 20 years. Maybe it's not that long, but it's that many books. Not just on World War II, not just on Germany, not just on Eastern Europe, not just on Judaism and what happened to Jews, and not just Russian history and Middle Eastern history, and just recently a book on China and what happens to not only Jews, because Jews are all over the world, but what happens to people who are not the mainstream and who are effectively discriminated against in one form or another. And I don't think, that's up to everybody whether or not they want to engage in understanding that history. But that is human history, and that is our collective experience. And it's not that it isn't going to happen in the future, because it has happened forever. And understanding that at a deeper level, and then what can you do about it? I mean, the exhibition here about the Danes standing up to the Nazis and saying to the king saying to the community, a Dane is a Dane. It doesn't matter whether they're Jewish or they're Catholic or they're Protestant or they're pink. It doesn't matter. They're a Dane, and they deserve to be treated as such. That's not the norm. That's unusual. And again, these are lessons that we all need to internalize and figure out how to treat each other and your neighbor and your countrymen, because if you don't, we know exactly what happens.
We have time for a few questions from the audience. There is a microphone that will be going around, so if you want to just raise your hand if you'd like to join the conversation. Sydney's passing that around. Thanks, Sydney. Hi.
Hi, thank you for sharing this fascinating story. My mother was a child in Austria and Vienna in those times, and I'm wondering, you said that your grandparents had gotten word that things were worse in Vienna than in Germany. Did they ever explain why? Did you ever learn why they were considered worse?
Yes, in Germany, the government wanted to get rid of Jews, but in Austria, the Germans were much more aggressive about getting Jews out of the country.
They tried that's where the Germans experimented with everything that they did later in Germany. So they did it first in Austria.
The people, you were talking about how your grandfather was trying to get this work done, and there were people pressuring him to not do this, and they were going to impact his business. Who are these people? Do you have any idea?
They were both Philadelphia. They were prominent Jews in Philadelphia and in New York.
Yeah.
What was their fear?
Yeah, Jews.
Jews.
No, Jews.
Again, it's hard to understand this, but in the United States, in this time period, anti-Semitism was in the open. People were openly anti-Semitic.
And they were afraid. Jews were afraid. So they were afraid if this came out, it would, be all over the press, and it would harm all of them.
I don't think in general Jews make waves. I think it's true today too, if they don't have to.
Yeah, because of the consequences.
So we have another question back here.
Hi, Peter and Jill. Thanks so much for your talk tonight. It was very inspirational. I know the trip was diverted, so I'm just curious, I know your grandmother collected people who were going to be the sponsors. What was the PR to get to the families in Austria ahead of time? Was there boots on the ground to let them know your grandfather was coming?
The Jewish Community Center advertised, I believe it was in a newspaper, that an American family was coming and that they were going to interview children, and they were going to select 50 children and take them back to the United States, and in a small community, obviously, under significant pressure. Everybody knew.
And 600 children and their parents showed up to be interviewed.
Think about that, okay? You're living in Vienna. You have probably more than one child. You find out that your might be able to have one of your children, or perhaps both, go to the United States, leave you, you might never see them again, and you're making the decision to put your child in the hands of people
Strangers.
you've never met. Just think about how much pressure, fear, concern for life you were feeling at the time to do that.
I have a question. First of all, Peter, Jill, this is fascinating, and thank you so much for doing this. Peter, you found out about this when you were in your 20s?
50s.
In your 50s?
Yeah.
And your father was almost 80?
Well, 78.
And when you found out, did you ever find out how much your father had known about the story?
He knew
or
it
did
all.
He knew it all?
Yeah.
And
As I said, Dad, like, what's up with you? You couldn't do this in, like, the family dinner table? We could have talked about this when I was 12?
And after you found that out, did you continue to talk to your dad about it, or was it just something that you could never really get into with him?
No, we took this trip, and we experienced the whole process, and he was emotional about it. And as I said, in the Jewish Community Center, he was crying, and that touched me. I don't think there was, he was 12 at the time, so he was a young boy, and how he internalized that was probably not very easy for him to talk about either. So just experiencing it with him was, I think, what was powerful.
I'm curious, of the 600 people who applied, because my grandparents and my mother were from Vienna, and they actually survived the war by escaping to Romania. But is there a list of the names of the... I'm just curious if my mother would have been like 6 years old.
We don't have a list, but if
I mean,
you
there is a list that the Holocaust, as far as I know, you can go to the...
If you went back to Vienna, you could read each one of them.
But those were researchers from the Holocaust Museum in Washington that were in Vienna going through these 90 boxes. So I'm sure there's a way to contact somebody at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and yeah.
This is kind of personal too. I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. I know that Krauss, with the spelling, is a fairly common name in Vienna, I think. It's my last name, and I really didn't know my father, and I'm sort of curious as to, I kind of had given up. Well, it's a long story. My parents were 15-year-old high school Protestant teenager and a 38-year-old Viennese Jewish philosophy professor, and they never married, and it's, it goes on like that. Yeah. But I kind of devoted my life to trying to know him, and because I tried to get away from my mother, which is another story, but that was really, really impossible, because turns out just recently, that anyway, just recently, I'm speaking with a Mayo Clinic, excuse me, neurologist at a party. I described him a little bit, and she said, Asperger's, I once visited him, and I opened his refrigerator. He was living in a hovel, unplugged, nothing but books, okay? And anyway, I'm sort of curious whether I might have the honor to be related to your fabulous grandparents, Peter. I don't know if that's possible.
I don't know, but I hope so.
I hope so too. Thank you.
So one question up front. We have one over here, and then we'll come back to Patty.
Yeah, I was just curious if you have any idea of whether your father and I guess there was his sister,
Yeah.
were angry at their parents for leaving them and going off to this country. And
I think that may be why Peter's father never talked about it. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know, but certainly possible, knowing the players.
Patty?
Do you know whether the Annenberg family was friends with your family, or whether they were involved either for or against this?
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, they're not mentioned in the manuscript. I know that because I would have recognized that.
You know, I'm trying to remember whether the Annenbergs were involved in Bristol or not, and that's probably a discoverable fact, but I don't think they were.
I have his biography, so I'm going to
Yeah.
All
That
right,
would
we
be,
have-
that would be how you'd connect them.
We have one final question. Amy, no pressure.
No pressure. So you've described your grandparents as being people who you remember as being grandparents, regular kind of people. So using that as a backdrop, regular people, I'm wondering what do you think their advice might be to young people who might be coming through this museum? What would they were regular people who made an extraordinary impact. So what do you think they would say to a group of young people today so to encourage them to act similarly?
That's a good question, and I don't know that I have a good answer. I think they would have viewed themselves, I think my grandfather would have viewed himself as doing the right thing. I think my grandmother would have been more grandiose about it, that not only it was the right thing, but that she was doing the right thing. But at the end of the day, I think it would be distilled down to having the backbone to stand up and do something they thought was right. And the sacrifice they made for that, I don't think they viewed as that grand a sacrifice.
And we actually have a question from the live stream, if we wouldn't mind having one of those. And I also just want to mention we have the child of one of the 50 children who is watching from the live stream. So
There you go.
amazing.
Wow.
So they're wondering, how has the rest of your family reacted to learning this story?
Well, we have our family here, so I suspect you should ask them directly.
Yeah, we have our 2 sons and their wives.
Hello, welcome.
I'm happy to pass the mic if anybody wants to.
Yeah, let's get a family representative.
Well, I'll say I found out about it when I was in high school, I think, or maybe I was in high school. And my parents sent me the manuscript and they said, you should read it. And I said, I'll get to it. And it waited a long time, and they didn't pressure me, but eventually I did read it, and I turned it into a research paper. And I think it was my senior year in high school that I used it as our final research paper. And I did a lot of the research that they talked about the anti-Semitism in the United States, and that was very impactful. Certainly about kids that were turned away. Even though Gilbert and Eleanor were able to bring kids to the United States. Apologize. And I think I echo some of what my dad said, which is it does affect you in a way that, you have to live up to something amazing, and it's hard to do that, but we try.
Can I definitively say that you guys are living up to it? I think on behalf of all of us here, you guys are telling the story. You're part of this incredible legacy, and I think it's so special and such an honor to be in your presence and to be hearing this story. And we're all so grateful to you, Peter and Jill, and the family, the Kraus family. So thank you.
Thank you.